Okay, welcome back. I am just finishing up my 5th minute of mixing. I've heard a lot of controversy about this, but over the years of doing it, I don't use 2 different containers to mix it. If you're starting, I suggest that you do that to make sure that everything is properly mixed. But as you can see, I'm just using a metal mixer. I always mix it by hand because it's tabletop and the dwell time isn't that long. But after 1.5 minutes of mixing, I'll put this beater through and I will make sure I scrape all the bottoms and the sides. I'll do that at least twice, if not 3 times. Then I will not have hardener or resin stuck to the side of the container. And if you can see this, mixing by hand, I have a lot less bubbles than if I were to use an auto mixer. I usually use the beater if I'm using casting resin, but due to the short dwell time on this epoxy, I always mix it by hand. That also is another controversy. Some people don't agree, but that's fine. So now that I have it mixed, I don't want to go over 1/4 inch thick. Usually, I would be pouring casting resin in, but I wanted to try using tabletop, not necessarily to reduce cost, but if I utilize tabletop, it dries fast, relatively, compared to if I were using casting resin. The casting resin would take about 3 days to dry. So, with me moving and using tabletop, I should be able to get 3 or 4 pours done in a day. Now the trade-off danger of that is you may get micro bubbles. I have had that before, and I am hoping not to have it this time, but we will see. If you don't want them, you need to be careful with your epoxy. Move to casting resin, and once you have casting resin and you're utilizing that, you can put it in a pressure pot. Some people use a vacuum changer. I prefer a pressure pot, just due to the fact that if you're using a vacuum chamber to squeeze out the excess air, we have found that it foams. So you will have to leave a substantial amount of extra space in the vacuum chamber to allow it to foam. But so far, over the last 2 years of doing this, we have not had the same result with the vacuum chamber. And the vacuum chamber does do a great job on pulling out all of the bubbles. As you noticed, I recoated my slab and pushed epoxy into the crack. I'm trying to make sure I'm not over 1/4 inch. As I can see, I have epoxy all through here, and all through there. And I have a nice coat on the actual slab again. Now, since that glove was soaked, I'll put a new one on. And it is time for the heat gun once again. Everyone always talks about how scary and time consuming it is to do epoxy. It's not that bad once you get the hang of it. So here we go with the heat gun. Turn it to a low setting. And you can see these bubbles. We're trying to force these bubbles out before the epoxy starts to set. And that heat gun or a torch will allow you to do that. So here we go. I always start it off to the side, then I'll come in and torch these bubbles. Blow these bubbles out with the heat gun. I used to always use a torch. But as you can see, it's popping those little bubbles. Giving me a nice clear resin. I don't want to sit in one spot too long because I have noticed that it'll create more bubbles if you overheat it. Put you back on the stand while I finish this. It's a balancing act. There is another bubble releasing agent. It was called Bust-A-Bubble. It worked pretty good, especially on slabs. But bubbles that are on top will just disappear. It seems to break the surface tension and allow the bubbles to come out. Once again, I am just heating this epoxy to try and keep it thin because I don't want it thickening up just yet. I'm wanting to give it a chance to let those bubbles come to the surface so I can get them out. And as you can see by the wave that it creates with this gun on low, it is not on high. The more I heat it, and the warmer it gets, the bigger wave I'll get. Like I said, just trying to give those bubbles that are super tiny a chance to get to the surface so I can have a nice clear finished product. Having these little micro bubbles is one of the common problems when using tabletop epoxy. So like I said, I am just making sure that the epoxy is thin. With the heat gun to allow most of them to rise. And we will see at the end if I made a mistake in utilizing tabletop. It may have a few, but it should definitely be clear enough for most people. The only way you'll be able to see these tiny little bubbles would be looking directly through the side all the way down the table. When you move the casting resin, it is also twice the price, so that's something to be aware of. I would not do my first project with casting resin, just because you'll probably make some mistakes. Just make it a small one, a small project, so it's not a big deal. Unless you're lucky and you can learn from the wealth of information out there on doing epoxy. Everyone has their opinions. I have noticed in the market, people usually don't talk about the conditions of their tables over time. So, as in some people using Rubio, which is a wax finish, and having the actual slab uncovered with epoxy. So it's natural grain, which some people like, and that's perfectly fine. Natural grain of wood, in my opinion, is beautiful anyways. The problem with that is you can sand the epoxy down with the wood before you apply your Rubio as you're supposed to. But when you go all the way to 5,000 grit on your sanding and move into polishing, takes a lot of time. I mean, a lot of time. So you have that factor in, but also we've discovered over time from tables that we've had at the house for a long time, the wood will actually expand and contract because Rubio does not actually seal the wood. It only adds a nice protective finish, but the wood itself can continue to breathe. So if you have it in your house and you're going between, let's say, summer and winter, air conditioned and heated, the moisture content in your house changes with the seasons depending on your air conditioning and heating. Not to mention if you have the windows open and it's humid in your house. So your wood slab will continue to expand and contract, and the only time it'll be perfectly flat between the epoxy and the actual wood slab would be when it's around the same conditions that the table was made in the first place. So if you desire to do that, just don't have a heart attack if that happens to you. Thank you for watching.